Hello. So today we are going to talk about disaster preparedness, people with disabilities, and Hurricane Katrina. So you may ask, what exactly is disaster preparedness? Well, according to Wikipedia, the definition is a research-based set of actions that are taken as a precautionary measure in the face of potential disasters. Now that is a lot of words, but basically it means plan ahead, just in case. Now, who needs to be prepared? Everybody. According to the Disaster and Vulnerable Population text by Baker and Cormier, individuals, groups, organizations, communities, and all levels of government need to be prepared. And that includes people with physical or mental or both disabilities. So in 2003, FEMA launched the READY campaign to raise public awareness about preparedness. It was short, sweet, and it got the point across. Number 1, be informed. Number 2, make a plan. Number 3, build a kit. Now, for the average American with no barriers, staying informed seems easy enough. What with radio, TV, social media, and informational websites to rely on. But what about those with disabilities? According to the Disasters and Vulnerable Populations book, data suggests that individuals with disabilities are among the most vulnerable during a disaster. They are less likely to have a personal evacuation plan, emergency kit, or an established social network due to less means, both financially and physically. Suppose you can't hear those news stories on the TV, or you can't look at the websites. That would make staying informed a lot more difficult. So let's use Hurricane Katrina as an example. According to Britannica.com, the first advisory about the tropical storm was made on August 23rd of 2005. The storm gathered strength over the next several days, earning it an official name, Katrina. By August 27th, the hurricane was classified a Category 3, but when it made landfall the morning of August 29th, it was a full-blown Category 4, with winds in excess of 170 miles per hour. Katrina first made landfall in Louisiana about 45 miles southeast of New Orleans, but it continued its course northeast, crossing the Mississippi Sound and making a second landfall later near Pearl River. Now, Katrina's storm surge was more than 26 feet high, and it slammed the cities of Gulfport and Biloxi, Mississippi. Hurricane Katrina's damage was devastating. So now that we know a little more about Katrina, let's discuss how much time people had between that first advisory on August 23rd and the day Katrina hit on August 29th. During those days, when Katrina was being tracked and evacuation orders had come into play, did the hearing impaired get the message? Did those confined to wheelchairs hatch a plan to go to safety? Now, I'm sure those with family or friends, people were made sure that those family members were kept informed. But what about those who had no family or no one else to look out for them? I'm sure most of the residents along the Gulf Coast were preparing during the whole week prior to the Katrina making landfall. They were following the news updates to stay informed. So again, I ask, what about those who could not stay informed because of a disability? The next step in FEMA's READY plan about preparedness says to make a plan. Now, how exactly do you make a plan for a potential disaster when you have no idea what it might be? Well, the American Red Cross and FEMA have guidelines about just that. As laid out in the Disasters and Vulnerable Populations text, The guidelines include things like involving all your family and friends to come up with an agreed upon place to shelter. Know who and how utilities will be turned off if necessary. Have an evacuation plan with multiple ways out and a designated meeting place in case family members are separated. It also suggests ways to evacuate, meaning what transportation will you use, and a lot more ideas are listed. But let's talk about what that second step might look for someone who has a disability. Perhaps they can't drive, or perhaps they're in a wheelchair. During the days before Katrina hit, when others were jumping in their cars with their families and Fido the dog to evacuate, what options did Jane, a woman in a wheelchair with no transportation or family nearby, have on her plan? Maybe Jane had no phone to call for help if needed, or no television to keep up with the latest information because she lived on a fixed income, fixed budget. Just think about that for a minute before we move on, and we'll talk about step 3 of FEMA's Ready Plan. So step 3 says, build a kit. Well, the general guidelines of the American Red Cross and FEMA's Preparedness Guide give specifics of what to include in that kit. A few items suggested are things like a flashlight and extra batteries, or a first aid kit that includes an extra supply of medications. Other things include days worth of canned foods and a gallon of extra water per person per day, and a lot of other useful ideas. Now let's think back to Jane in the wheelchair with no family, no means of transportation, living on a minimal amount from her Social Security check. How do you suppose Jane can afford all of those extra items, especially medications, which are already so expensive to begin with? She can barely stay afloat just with the bare necessities on a good day, much less afford to stock up on supplies. Just something to think about. So I wonder what Jane did when Katrina hit land and water surges were flooding everything, already making it difficult to get any kind of help for even the average neighbor. And even if help did arrive, did they have room for her and her wheelchair? And if they did manage to get Jane and her wheelchair into some sort of transportation, maybe a boat or a bus, where could they take her that was wheelchair accessible and had her specific medications on hand? All of these are really good questions, and I'm willing to bet that this is just one example of a scenario that real people with disabilities faced during this trying time, and also a deadly time. So according to Baker and Cormier in Disasters in Vulnerable Populations, there are over 55 million Americans with one or more disabilities, representing nearly 20% of our population. It is critical that these individuals are as prepared as far in advance of a disaster as possible so they don't end up like our fictional Jane with no options. So some guidelines for making a plan for those with disabilities is offered by the American Red Cross and FEMA. A few of those suggestions include assessing any limitations you might have that will require assistance in an emergency evacuation. If you're deaf, use a strobe light alarm device. Or if you're not deaf but just hard of hearing, use an alarm accessory that makes a loud, low-pitched sound. Another fantastic idea is to register with your local emergency service organization to provide you with special warning procedures and evacuation, and help develop a plan to evacuate ahead of time. Make a list of people who will be part of your network and make sure those people in your network know how to operate any medical devices that you have, such as an oxygen machine or even a wheelchair. So the good news is that we learned a lot from the experiences with Hurricane Katrina. A few disabilities and health emergency preparedness tools and resources are put together nicely on the CDC's website, www.cdc.gov. FEMA also has a fact sheet on their website with accommodations specific to people with disabilities during disasters in Alabama. All disaster survivors, including people with disabilities, can access resources at that disaster recovery centers. All disaster recovery centers are equipped with tools to accommodate disaster survivors' needs. A few of those things that are available are documents in large print and braille for survivors who are blind or have low vision. They have iPads that provide video remote sign language available upon request. CapTel phones that display captioning of a conversation allowing the caller to follow along visually. Accessible parking, ramps, entrances, and restrooms. Pocket talkers, which are adjustable headsets for survivors with hearing disabilities, are available. And even American Sign Language interpreters are available. So to sum it up, whether you're preparing for a disaster such as Hurricane Katrina or one of our many tornado days here in Alabama, preparedness is key. Disaster preparedness is not just something for the average American citizen. It is something for all people, regardless of ability. Everybody has the right to be prepared for disaster, and it might just save your life or the life of someone you love. Thank you very much for watching.